Hey friends, May is Feminist Frequency's 12th birthday. Can you believe it? 12 years of feminist media criticism, of working to end abuse in the games industry. So if you want to keep us going for another 12 years, please consider donating today. You can visit feministfrequency.com for more info.
Piper Laurie really brings the religious zealotry, the fervor, and just of the shame of femaleness. Carrie is like wearing her dress, or that she's made for herself for the prom, and her mother says like something like, "I can see your dirty pillows."
Dirty pillows.
How can you forget a line like that?
Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio. This is the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love. I'm Anita Sarkeesian, and I'm joined today by two women who don't like it when mom locks them in the closet with the creepy Jesus statue. Carolyn Pettit.
Super creepy.
Ebony Adams.
I'm comfortable in there. I'm fine.
All right.
This week we're talking about Carrie, the 1976 horror classic selected as a topic for this season by our patrons. Stay tuned. Hello, friends.
What's up?
Hey.
I need to acknowledge how horrifying what the Israeli government is doing in Palestine right now.
Yes.
Like, I wanted to bring it up last week and I didn't. And I don't know, I got a lot of shit on the internet for talking about it, as one does. But it's really, really horrifying. And I'm having a little... I'm having a hard time with it, but who gives a shit what I'm having a hard time with? It's horrifying.
Yeah, it truly is. And if we're going to, lose listeners, lose friends or whatever, well, that's just, those are the breaks. But what the Israeli government is doing right now is fucked up. And if you are having trouble, disconnecting your ideas of anti-Semitism from, the notion of the Israeli government, those two things are not synonymous, Jewish identity and Israel. So I encourage you to think that through. What's happening is fucked up. And this podcast is anti-settler colonialism. So,
yeah. We are.
And that includes the U.S.
No, absolutely. Like, people are giving me shit being like, but that, if you're talking about settler colonialism, then, what about America and Canada?
And you're like, oh, yeah, let's do us too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. I don't have a problem with that being called out because
right?
It's true, right? I do want to say, though, so the history of this situation and the horrific violence that has been, occupation and all of it that's been happening has been happening for decades. It's been a really long thing. There's a really intense history that involves the British and the Europeans and the Americans who very much caused and continue to support this horrific situation. And it's the history is really messy. And I think that one thing I've been thinking about is that there are so many more, kind of mainstream liberals or mainstream people with democratic ideals that are starting to recognize this as a problem, right? That the last time Israel bombed the fuck out of Palestine, it was like crickets, right? People were not on a large scale talking about it. So there is something that I'm seeing that I take at least a little bit of comfort in terms of the left is becoming a little more progressive, or the mainstream left is becoming more progressive in America, at least. And, we could track it back to 2016, right? The election of Trump and seeing all of these different movements and folks really, following activists and understanding more about what's happening in the world and really learning these histories. And I think there's something powerful about that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is powerful to see with your own eyes, history. Obviously, we can't, it's not a net shift in the right direction because, obviously the right is becoming more entrenched in white nationalism and fascism and everything in more overt ways too. But, I think to just have voices in our legislative body, to have Rashida Tlaib and people, in our bodies that give voice to these issues is very significant. And like just the response to what's happening on social media and everything is so much greater than what I've ever seen in the past.
Yeah, and I think like if you're someone who is tempted to look askance at the voices that you see advocating for a free Palestine, advocating for a solidarity across borders and across, ethnic communities, you can find people. It is not hard to find, people within Israel, Jewish people, who are advocating the same thing. So if you don't want to listen to me because you're like, well, Ebony's not Jewish, and she doesn't know what she's talking about, these people are out there. This is not something that is imposed from without, like a worldview that's imposed from without from people who don't know what they're talking about. Yeah. So, I am heartened by what seems to be more mainstream in the US acceptance of the need to do something, radical and revolutionary and liberatory, in support of the Palestinians. Because this is new. I'm in my sporty 40s, and for a long time it was like, what do they call it? The third rail. People just did not want to talk about it. And the fact that we can now, I saw someone on Twitter being like, don't forget the people who lost jobs. And, there is still a political cost, but, it's slightly less perhaps than there used to be.
Yeah, like the how deeply entrenched America is in like pro-Israel and the Israeli lobby and all of that it has really shaped and formed how we talk about it or don't talk about it. And, it is entrenched in the government so deeply that I found out recently that in Texas, if you work for a nonprofit or a school, like any state body, you have to sign a document that says you will not speak ill of Israelis, of the Israeli government. It's like in Texas, and I'm sure it's in other states too, but like what the fuck is America doing? I know the answer to that, but we're not getting into that. I've dealt with funders who got mad that one of our employees tweeted about the bombing and being pro-Palestine, like threatened to pull funding because of it. So like this shit is for fucking real, right? There's a lot of pressure to maintain Israel's power.
Oh, absolutely. And that has not evaporated by any stretch.
No.
I mean, there's, right? Like, so I want to give special credit to Tamoor Hussain, who is a, Muslim, a British Pakistani Muslim who, works in in games journalism, games criticism. And he put out a video, saying, hey, basically, hey, games industry, like, where are the voices on this? It's crickets compared to other social justice issues that have arisen in the past, in recent years. And he outlined very clearly, like, why that tendency exists and why it has been that way historically, while also saying, like, why it's, it's bullshit to the narrative. One of the narratives is, well, there's just always been unrest in the Middle East. That's just the way it is. Or it's too complicated for us on the outside to understand, or these kinds of obfuscating things. And anyway, he really kind of just very methodically addressed each of these arguments. And, but then, so just to illustrate that, like, the sort of pressure and kind of silencing and chilling effect around these conversations is still in effect. The website IGN, major massive games website. Clearly, there were people on the editorial staff there who felt it was necessary to say something, and they did put out a statement. With which also called for donations to charities to aid the Palestinian people who are affected by all the violence that's happening there. But then I think like sometime late last night, as we're recording this, that statement was deleted, and a much more like equivocating, like, we both sidesing kind of statement, which, we can only speculate, but in terms of its language and everything, feels very much like, oh, this was handed down from the corporate, masters sort of thing, was put in its place. So, and that's just like one example in the industry that I happen to know best, but I'm sure that you can see that reflected and repeated in other fields and areas as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, that's the thing. It always feels awkward to be like, the world is on fire, and then be like, let's talk about movies. Like, I know that they're not mutually exclusive, but I'd never know how to transition back into like this space, you know? So,
Anita, do you want to workshop some segues that you can just have on deck, you know, that can be like, and now we turn from, you know, this shitty thing into a shitty thing in movies, you know, but like smoother and cooler.
Yeah,
we'll get like 10 or 20 together.
Hit me up after the podcast. We'll go through that.
Okay.
Okay, cool. All right, y'all. Let's get into the topic this week. It's almost hard to imagine a time when the name Stephen King wasn't synonymous with horror. The book that first put him on the map was 1974's Carrie, which would also become his first novel to be adapted into a film. Cinematic adaptations of King's works are hit or miss, to put it mildly, but few have had the cultural significance and staying power of Carrie, directed by Brian De Palma, one of the most significant American directors of the late 20th century, and also kind of sexist.
Stay tuned, Anita. Right.
Oh, good. Y'all, I just read this shit. I didn't write it. I don't know what's coming up. It's fine. All right. The combination of Carrie's narrative with De Palma's directing style results in a film of fascinating contradictions. Oh, there it is. Carolyn, you're so good. We can absolutely see the male gaze in things like De Palma's love of leering at female bodies in slow motion, and yet there are also strong arguments to be made for feminist readings of the film. The anger that animates protagonist Carrie White as her telekinetic powers wreak havoc on the people who have oppressed her and ridiculed her and ostracized her for her entire life has felt righteous and validating to so many girls and women who have helped cement Carrie's status as a classic in the decades since its release. The theme of the poll from which our patrons selected Carrie as a discussion topic was bad mothers, and in the film, her mother, Margaret, as a religious zealot who keeps Carrie living in ignorance of the most basic aspects of her own body and tries to make her feel deeply ashamed of her desire to go to the prom and have healthy relationships with other people her age. Meanwhile, her classmates relentlessly ridicule her for her social awkwardness and inability to fit in. No wonder she wants to burn it all down.
Yeah, and maybe we should, you know, since I do allude to it in this, or you know, we allude to it in this intro, like start with that fascinating opening sequence of the slow motion kind of girls' locker room shower scene.
Yes, before we do that, I definitely 100. I mean, we're gonna spend the whole time talking about that fucking scene, to be honest. But have you two seen Carrie before?
Oh yeah.
Like, is anyone watching this for the first time?
It's hard to say it's one of my favorite films. I wouldn't say that, but I've seen it multiple times.
You know, I don't know. Like, I certainly like so much of the so much of the imagery of it is familiar to me. Of course, the prom scene, the blood, you know, whatever, all of it basically. And yet I can't recall ever having sat down and watched it before. So
isn't that so fascinating how like films can become such a part of the cultural zeitgeist that you're like, you're so familiar with it, but don't know if you've ever seen it. Like, we've all had that experience, right? That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. I was just curious because I think that this is such an interesting film to see for the first time, like, now, if that's the case. I know I've seen it before, but I don't. There's a lot of stuff that I was like, oh shit, I don't remember this.
Listen, you mentioned the shower scene and saying we're going to spend our time talking about that. I'm going to spend all my time talking about the scene where the gym teacher is walking around the principal's office smoking a cigarette. This movie is so solidly a product of the 1970s. I cannot get enough of it.
Yeah,
I cannot get enough.
For sure. Okay, so Carolyn, you want to take us into that horrifying scene?
I mean, I think it's fascinating the way that, for understandable reasons, I mean, in horror and in other media, female power is so often tied up in female, like, sexuality. And particularly in Carrie, I believe we can say that Carrie's, certainly at least in the film, I have not read the novel, in the film, it really seems to me that her telekinesis and the anger of it is a product of the anger that comes from everything about her and her life being so repressed by her mother and by society at large. And so that's where I think so much of the feminist energy of the film, if we do want to call it that, comes from is like, I don't know. I'm so torn on how I feel about De Palma's use of sexuality and like the male gaze here, because like, I think that it is important that it is not a film, that is itself sexually repressed, right? Because it is a film about the dangers of sexual repression in a lot of ways.
I got no tensions about how pissed off it made me. So
I didn't expect that you would.
Yeah.
I was more like, I will admit, like I find the social dynamics of that opening scene so fascinating because in a lot of ways, like I relate to Carrie. And so when you see you basically have the clique of like the cool girls, right? Who know how to perform femininity in like and female sexuality in ways that have a certain cultural currency, right? And their makeup is done just so, and their hair is done just so, and all of this. And Carrie has always been outside of that. I find that the shower scene is really effective at kind of making you feel the way that these girls collectively, the Nancy Allens and the Amy Irvings and all of them have this literacy of like how they are supposed to be women in the world, how they are supposed to be girls and women in the world, and how Carrie just doesn't have that in the same way, and how so much of I think the tension of the film comes from that, and I just find that so fascinating because that is something that I experience all the time myself as like, as a trans woman, but as a woman who isn't necessarily interested in performing femininity in the most like conventionally feminine and socially accepted of ways, and who nonetheless constantly feels the cost of not doing that, and also like does have part of me that feels like, God, I wish I knew how to do that, or I wish I could get away with that. I wish I could do that, but I can't because my body is this way. Because if I do, I'll do it wrong. I'll call too much negative attention to myself, what have you. There's just so much going on, I think, there that I'm sure so many girls and women experience in different ways. Certainly in their adolescence and in high school, but also, in other aspects of their lives as well.
Yeah, that. Thank you for sharing that. Like, I feel like that's very real. And I my problem with it, and honestly, with a large portion of this movie, is how deeply objectified and sexualized all of these girls and young women are. And Carolyn, I hear your point of how do we not reinforce the puritanical values of the mother in the filmmaking of a movie that's trying to challenge that? But I would say that it became more male-gazy than it became challenging of that.
Sure.
So, for example, that opening sequence in the locker room is straight up like male fantasy porn about like girls with fucking pillow fights and shit. Like,
yes.
That is not like... I've been in girls' locker rooms. It was miserable every time. I hated it. I tried to avoid it as much as possible. And that shit didn't happen like that. So, like, there are ways in the filmmaking that they could have shown, like, the cool girls and the, like, Carrie all alone in the corner. And the other thing about it, they could have shown that dynamic without being like, hey, look how sexy these girls are. Like, look at their bodies. Look at all this whatever. And then the thing about Carrie is that she, like, in the shower is, like, rubbing her breasts for, like, a full 200 hours. Like, he's sitting there on her body, like, she's touching herself. Like, it's extremely sexualized. It's not just a woman who's alone taking a shower and gets her period, Like, that I found that really, like, this is this dude's particular gaze and particular view, and he's putting it on there. And that transitions into the rest of the film, because the way that they show the gym class, the way that they show these extended sequences of the girls in like really short shorts with like their boobs bouncing everywhere, like all over their body parts, like that's not conveying. It's conveying the sexualization of the women, of these girls and women. It's not conveying to me the dichotomy and the distinction that I think this movie is clearly placing, right? Clearly presenting.
I want to push back a little bit, as someone who had a slightly different reaction to the shower and locker scene. For the most part, I agree that like the scenes of the like mass of giggling girls doing the like Pantene hair flip in the locker room, like it was so cliche, you know. And again, we're talking about a movie that's almost 50 years old at this point, right? And so many of those kind of the tropes that we see, like, you know, visually landing here, we've seen in other movies so many times that it, you know, it seems almost like a parody of itself. It's like a Meatballs or, you know, something like that, right? Excuse me. And it was easy for me to dismiss it, you know, upon viewing, because in a way, I'm watching those girls through like Carrie's eyes, and seeing what she sees, which is this sort of like undifferentiated mass of successful femininity that she does not have access to, and yet that she desires to be part of. And I found when I was watching the scenes of her, like, you know, sort of lovingly soap up her body, I was bracing myself to feel gross at, you know, a camera lingering on what is, you know, ostensibly a young girl's body. Obviously, Sissy Spacek was not actually 16 or 17 when she filmed this movie, you know, but, you know, that's what we're supposed to be seeing, right? And the moment of disgust never landed for me, because, and this probably has 95% to do with how wonderful an actress Sissy Spacek is. But there is something about her face and the way that she moves her body that resisted, for me, any kind of, you know, lurid consumption. It felt very much to me like someone who is so in her own space, and away from home is really the only time and in the only environment in which she can explore her body and feel delight in the way that her skin feels and the length of her legs, you know, the softness of her arms. So it's probably a more charitable reading. In fact, it almost certainly is a more charitable reading than Brian De Palma deserved, because that guy really is on one. But I do want to say that, you know, there is space for an alternative viewing, which, to be fair, is not entirely supported by all of what comes, and perhaps is only really available upon repeat viewings. Because if you come to this movie fresh and you've never read the book and you don't know anything about the movie or about the storyline, you probably are going to be like, oh, all right, you know, titties and, you know, whatever.
Which, I mean,
and bouncing new bodies. But for me, watching it again, this is how I was.
And let's not like let's be clear about, I mean, Brian De Palma's career is characterized to some degree by the you know, the male gaze. I mean, as such.
Yeah.
So certainly, like, whatever we think about it in regard to Carrie and the scene in particular, like, you know, I mean, like, Brian De Palma, like, is gleeful about, like, his, you know, and unapologetically so about, like, his love of objectifying women on the movie screen.
Yeah. You know those, when you watch Amazon films on Amazon, they have like the cast and the trivia pop-ups that you can have access to. One of the ones that I saw was like in the scene, the gym class outside, where Chris is slapping, I can't remember the name of the character she's slapping. It might have been Amy Irving, Sue. Like, Brian De Palma wanted the slap to feel real enough and the reaction to feel authentic enough that Sue would cry in that moment. And it wasn't happening. So she wound up getting slapped. Like, they wound up doing like 30 takes, you know, and it was just brutal for everybody involved. And the person who wrote the trivia was like, this, you know, might be used in support of the Brian De Palma equals misogynist theory. And I was just like, oh, who wrote this? I love you, person.
That's great. I love that reading, Ebony, of that scene. I think it's really beautiful. I think it's totally like headcanon,
like, it's
like
bullshit,
as Carolyn is saying.
but...
Like, yeah, I'm not going to repeat what Carolyn just said, but like, I wish that was how it was. You know, like, I wish that was like an interpretation that I could ever like believe in. But what I think could have happened, though, if it wasn't directed by Brian De Palma, that I mean, look, it was filmmaking in the 70s, and all those fucking dudes back then were all, you know, a problem with a capital P. But I was like on board with you too up until like Carrie having this moment to herself, and it's the only time she could have it, because I love the idea of her seeing these women that way, right? Like looking in on them and seeing them be happy and connected and, like beautiful and all of this stuff, and her not having access to it. Like, I think that I could almost buy that if they didn't do the sort of sexualizing Carrie in the shower moment.
Should we get like what do they call it? A stinger, a button that you guys can push when I make a reading like that? It's just someone yelling, left reading.
Well,
It's like,
that's what I was going to say is that I think that reading is entirely valid, but to me it does bring us back to the kind of conversation that I was trying to have with the left, with our recent episode on left reading, of like those differences, those points where we may personally have one experience of a film,
right,
while still having to acknowledge or not acknowledge, if we don't want to, like that the cultural impact of a thing is probably that it's not, that probably the cinemas are not full, like that the men watching this film are not saying, yes, like this is a moment where Carrie is like really approaching some kind of self-actualization.
You don't think that's what's happening?
Yeah.
in the theaters, in the local multiplex? No, I totally get you. Like, the weight of the most of audience reactions for this film is not, going to be like this slow unpacking of what might be occurring in there.
But I also think it's so essential. They're like, I think part of what's so essential about great criticism is that we can put these reactions out into the world to disrupt or to destabilize the kind of the what we might call mainstream isn't the word I'm looking for, but like the what's the word for like the hegemonic, kind of cultural response to a thing.
And I think one of the other things that's so interesting about that scene or that sequence of scenes, and I don't suggest that the film is doing this, but I'm saying that, it's something that we can have confirmed for us as we watch it, is the question of who teaches successful femininity. And, this is something that you were getting at, Caro, the idea that like Carrie does not have access to a willing and able model for what she learns, will make her properly feminine and properly a woman. And the response from the girls that she gets, plug it up, it's this horrific scene to watch, the way that they brutalize her and make fun of her. And then the gym teacher comes out of her office and is like, you need to figure this out, grow up, whatever. And, you're left asking yourself, like, how would she know? This is, right. It really, it makes you confront the notion that like femininity and all of the trappings of it is not this instinctual essence. It is not innate. These behaviors, these looks, the aesthetic of it is not something that arises, out of the ground without tending, without access to those kinds of like feminine networks. Of course, Carrie would be left completely at sea, and it is, like useful confirmation, and that kind of like unsticks a little bit of maybe the gender essentialism that is rife throughout this movie. I mean, the fact that like Carrie starts, menstruating, and this signifies like the onset of her telekinetic powers, or at least the rapid intensification of her telekinetic powers, is like, okay, let's unpack that. This is certainly like the fact that this was written, directed by a man, based upon a book written by, and see, I'm doing the gender essentialism here, two non-menstruators, is evident, completely evident here. The idea that it's some witchy thing that happens to people when they start menstruating.
And Stephen King was 26 when he wrote this book, so he didn't really, he might need to learn some things.
Listen, I don't think Stephen King at 76, has an entirely better notion, but...
Yeah, well, can we talk a little bit about, like, what... this is a film that is a part of, feminist canon in some way, or that might be too charitable, but, like a lot of feminists really love this movie. And like, there's a lot of there's a lot of satisfaction in some ways about like Carrie getting them, like getting this power and like getting back at her classmates for treating her that way. I don't know what if you two wanted to expand a little bit on how you felt about it.
Vengeance is righteous. Like, yes, there's something so satisfying about watching Carrie assume the mantle, of this power and just devastate everyone who has been, connected to her pain or even remotely, peripheral to her pain. The book, makes it even more clear that she is offering no quarter. Like the entire town is destroyed, to the point where any survivors, the few survivors have to relocate. Like she just goes completely scorched earth. And I am here for it, that's one thing about the villainous moves of the people of this, they are odious. And so when Carrie finally snaps, you're like, I gotta hand it to her. If I had these powers, I would be tempted to also, bust a smooth move on the high school gym. But luckily the powers that be did not give me those powers.
It's also it's very interesting to me that at the prom, her date clearly is into her. It started as a, hey, do me a favor, boyfriend, and go out with this chick who give her the night of her life or whatever. And they spend so much time building that comfort and building that relationship in that moment, and him trying to make her more comfortable and starting to see her as a peer in some ways, and not just this loser that he has to get stuck with. And and then there's this moment where it's and the teacher who's trying to help her out and all this stuff, there's this moment where she's like, fuck everyone, you are all garbage.
Yes, you're all trash.
None of you matter. All of your little allied cards can go fuck themselves.
Yeah.
There's a scene that I literally wrote in my notes, dancing and spinning, fuck off. The scene where they're dancing. So there's so much interesting filmmaking happening here, right? The shots where you have the person in power in the foreground taking up half of the screen, and then the person without power in the background, in smaller, and he sits on this shot forever, right? And then he goes to the next one and they're really dramatic. And then the scene where they're dancing and the camera is spinning for a smooth, I don't know, 5 minutes? I was like, y'all, this whole audience is gonna fucking hurl all over these movie theaters. They wouldn't stop. And I'm like, are you trying to unsettle us here? This was a sweet moment between them, and Carrie's becoming a little, not softer is not the right word, but becoming a little more comfortable with her date and all of that. So I was like, are you trying to unsettle us? I was like, okay, cut to something else,
It is
please.
something I miss about modern mainstream movies is the lack of time that shots are given. You do find that, in earlier periods that directors, spent more time on shots, that it wasn't such quick cuts, away from things, which makes things propulsive, but it doesn't give an audience time to sort of sit with.
Yeah,
and
I'm
the feeling.
Starting to appreciate that, but that spinning, man, I was just oh my God.
But I do feel like everything about the prom leading up to the moment where the bucket of blood falls really does work to disarm you, to kind of and I mean, God, you want it. Certainly I mean, it was because I identified so closely with Carrie's insecurities, with her feelings that in society she's never, not really liked, not really seen as attractive. I mean, everything about that whole prom sequence, it's orchestrated carefully to I mean, like you said, and Anita, her date is actually sweet, and and you believe that he kind of means what he says. There, that line where they're deciding if they're going to vote for themselves, and he says to hell with false modesty. It's you want Carrie to actually have some faith in herself, to believe in herself, to know that she's beautiful and worthy of being liked and loved, and of course, and then you get that prolonged applause. Like everyone in the auditorium is like cheering and seems so genuinely happy to see Carrie, who was up until like that night, this like outcast, like loser in their midst, have this moment where she's like, seen as maybe they're all like, oh wow, we had it all wrong. We were so wrong to have been so cruel to her all this time. But then, of course, the shoe drops as the bucket drops, and you sort of realize that no, like it's all just to make the mockery and the cruelty that comes that much worse. And so, which then, of course, makes Carrie's vengeance so satisfying and and feels so righteous. Yeah.
The poll that we gave to the patrons was about bad mothers.
Right.
I feel like we would do a disservice if we didn't at least talk about her mom.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Holy moly, yeah.
Yeah, go, someone do it.
Oh, okay.
Well, I guess one thing I want to note about the home that her mother, played by Piper Laurie. So both Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie were nominated for Oscars for their performances in this film. And but I was, this is down to Brian De Palma again, like the visuals of the house, and probably his production designers and everything too, but just the the religious iconography in that home is so it is a presence in and of itself as this oppressive thing that you cannot escape from. There's a moment when they're at the dinner table, the two of them, and it's like they're literally having dinner with the Last Supper. Like the Last Supper image is there on the wall, like right up against their table. There's a moment where Carrie is like looking in a mirror, and I think you see like Jesus or something, like kind of looking over her shoulder at her because of the way something is reflected, like an image on the wall is reflected in the mirror, and all of this, but just, yeah. So Piper Laurie really brings the religious zealotry, the fervor, and just the sense of shame that a woman, that in her eyes, and in so much of, like, I'd say conservative religion and so much of American Christianity of the past, decades since this film came out, of the shame of femaleness and the shame of being a woman. That perhaps the most immediately illustrative line of all is when Carrie's like wearing her dress, or that she's made for herself for the prom, and her mother says like something like, "I can see your dirty pillows,"
pillows.
Which is just how can you forget a line like that?
Is dirty pillow, is that a thing, or was that just made up for the book or movie or whatever?
It's an old timey kind of thing.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, certainly pillows, but I think it's hard to know what came first, the chicken or the egg. But it's certainly an old timey thing that I've heard before. I mean, Margaret White, Carrie's mom, represents like one particular flavor of like the kind of patriarchy that women ingest and then, vomit back up. And the girls in the school represent another flavor. But crucially, like, women are the ones, responsible for all of the torment.
Yeah.
That Carrie experiences, which is so interesting and horrifying. But yeah, I mean, the fact that, Margaret White, Carrie's mom, is this, unstable religious zealot who almost like gleefully makes Carrie repeat these horrifying things about women and about how women are the source of all sin, and women are, made from sin, and, are not only tempted themselves to sin, but tempted to lead others to sin. It's horrifying and yet so accurate, the ways in which, women become like the current that continues to like push these bullshit, horrifying attitudes, onto new generations. And we just, the girls in the school who are just like master manipulators. There's 30 different varieties of women to be upset with in this film. The men involved are, rarely as effective. They're not the ones who drive the engine in any way. They're not, characters who we remember. Even, a character like Tommy Ross, played by William Catt, I literally forget and, like confuse him with John Travolta as Billy Nolan in my mind. Like I keep forgetting because those are not the ones that stick with you. It's these horrifying figures of just like this, cruel femininity, as if to suggest that there is something about the feminine itself that can go so horribly wrong in so many different ways.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the dynamic between Carrie and her mom is really interesting too, and something really believable in it, in the way that Carrie, as so many people who have abusive relationships do, Carrie sort of learns to diffuse, her mom to like there's a point where her mom is. I've been really like overbearing and abusive, and like maybe it's right after she put Carrie in the closet, with the creepy Jesus statue and everything. And when she comes out, Carrie says, "Thank you, Mama. Like thank you for recognizing that was what I need. I needed that punishment. I needed that." Like I feel like it's you learn when you live with an abuser often to tell them what they want to hear, to like diffuse the situation, to take on the responsibility yourself, even when you haven't done anything wrong. And so obviously, ultimately, her mother gets quite the comeuppance, and which and again another wonderful visual touch, because the way that she is skewered by those knives and other implements is, of course, a mirror of the creepy Jesus statue and the wounds that it has suffered. But yeah, really fascinating. Speaking of this pattern of like the women being the engines of torment and abuse in this film, I just want to say for myself that like I hate the Sue Snell, the Amy Irving character, as much as all the other girls and women in
definitely.
this. Like I feel like she thinks that she's like doing something good by like telling her boyfriend to like take Carrie to the prom, and then she goes to the prom as if like to see like what a nice thing she's done, and it just feels to me so fucking patronizing and so like I'll give poor Carrie, like what an outsider, like let me give her from my place of privilege, let me toss her like one little crumb for her miserable life. I'm not gonna genuinely like befriend her or like welcome her into the circle or like actually like authentically care for her as a person. Fuck you. Like it's
when the gym teacher calls them out, you're like waiting for them, the students, to be like, "Oh yeah, you're right. This is it." Like, yeah, why don't I like be friends with her or like take like go to the mall with her or whatever? Instead, it's like, no, we're doing the right thing, and you're like, "Oh my god, woman."
Yeah, but you know what? It was kind of satisfying in that it felt very real.
Yeah,
because. Fucking high school.
Oh God,
was terrible, terrible.
Well,
and it was much more rare for some fucked up and just brutally cruel 16-year-old in gym class to realize the error of their ways when getting called out. This is much more realistic. Like this is how kids are. They're terrible.
Yeah, seriously. I do want to just make sure that we wrap up with like the ending, right? So like Carrie doesn't make it. She's not the final girl in this one. She like, takes the whole school down and takes her mom down and herself at the same time. And like there is a frustration in that, right? Like she couldn't just get revenge. She had to also be punished for that act.
Yeah. I feel like, it's like the oppression that creates her that leads her, it also consumes her in the end. Like it does not, like she does not win over it. And, while it may be like, there may have been some sort of satisfaction in like seeing her go on, maybe to emerge from that and walk away from the smoldering town to whatever awaits her elsewhere. I do, there is for me a kind of tragic truth in her fate that I think is, like is good, like is a good note for the story to end on. I don't know. To me,
I don't think this film or the book it was based on, like, it's not the kind of story, the sort of imagination or the narrative space to envision a way in which Carrie is rehabilitated after what she does, and then can go on to lead some sort of like healthy or happy life, nor can it envision a way in which Carrie like leans in to being a badass vigilante.
I love that.
And like,
sequel.
exactly, right? Neither of those options are available. So I think, it's sort of an of course thing. Like, this is the denouement that it was always leading towards.
Yeah, cool. All right, Carrie. Hey, if you want to help choose episode topics, please become a patron of ours. Patreon.com/femfreak. All right, we'll be right back with some freakouts. Just really quick, I wanted to remind y'all that the Games and Online Harassment Hotline is here for you, for your friends, and your colleagues. We provide emotional support to folks who make or play games, which is such a broad range of people. So, you might not need it today, but maybe you need it tomorrow. So we just want you to know about it. You can learn more at gameshotline.org. What's your freak out? Now it's time to talk about what's thrilling us, moving us, upsetting us, or infuriating us this past week. Ebony, you went on a little trippy trips.
Yeah, so I am fully vaccinated, and I had the opportunity to go see my family for the first time in about 15, 16 months. So I went to Vegas. It was a phenomenal trip. I got to squeeze the hell out of my nephew and niece. And one of the things we did while we were there, we went to this place called Area 15, which is this immersive, it's like this conglomeration of like immersive experiences, many of them VR. It's got fantastic artwork adorning the walls, just everywhere. It's a space that invites you in and makes you want to like touch and look and climb on everything. It's really, really cool. It costs a lot of money, which is not the subject of my freak out, but another part is. So there is, part of the experience that you can take leads you into this section where you are encouraged to like climb stairs and slide down things and, push buttons and crank levers and all kinds of things. And it is so, so cool. And as far as I can tell, it is completely inaccessible.
Mm-hmm.
And it never even occurred to me that this was the case. And this is a fault that I want to acknowledge in myself, but also say we all need to do better. Until I got up onto like, I don't know, the second or third level of this thing, having happily climbed the stairs to get up there. And I saw a woman surrounded by her friends, sort of unsure of where to go because the next stage was more stairs or a slide that she couldn't access. And so she seemed literally like stuck in this corner. And I don't know if her friends had, lifted up her, carried her up this first series of stairs. I don't know how she had gotten there. But I just thought like, what the fuck? Like the entire rest of, my experience there was tempered by this knowledge. Like all of these cool things there were just inaccessible to so many people. I had a great time to the point where I, texted Anita afterwards and was like, oh, I really want to go to this thing. And just knowing that there's so many people who couldn't enjoy it, who couldn't even get in. There's spaces you have to like crawl through or, shimmy sideways or whatever. I just want us to do better. The people the creative team responsible for putting together this amazing facility clearly are big brain geniuses, and you have the imagination to create something that is available to more people. So yeah, that's my freak out. And again, like cost is another thing because each of the experiences in there costs a separate price. So we're gonna have another conversation about it would be great if poor people, working class people had access to this kind of stuff. I saw, okay, I sorry. Salma Hayek's husband is a French billionaire, and I swear this is related. And is moving forward on this like state of the art art gallery to house his modern art collection. One of the signature pieces of which is a 4-meter tall statue recreation of the rape of the Sabine women. And what is interesting to me about this is that the statue, it's 4 meters tall. So what is that, like 12 feet or something? It is actually a giant candle. And at the opening of the gallery, it will be lit and it will burn down for the next 6 months until it is gone. That the piece of art will be gone. And is, designed to illustrate the ephemerality of life and the transitory nature of all things, right? Which I get, but there was a knee-jerk reaction that I had where I was like doing the crude like wank off gesture to myself. Cause I'm like, we need to get rid of billionaires and we need to get rid of a certain kinds. Like this dude is going to spend so much money for this thing. And, who's going to have access to this art? It's ostensibly open to everyone, but how many people can actually get there and partake of this art and see it, right? And then it just, it's blowing my mind, I just think there's so many beautiful, wonderful, challenging, interesting experiences and sites out there, but really there is an access point and there is a price point that completely shuts most people out, and I'm sick of it. Okay, sorry. It wasn't a well-formed thought. It was just me being on one today. That's my freak out.
I wish that I could enter your brain for 0.5 seconds sometimes.
You would, it would be horrifying. You would never come out the same.
It's amazing. But yeah, I hear you around accessibility and, I hope that in some ways, the world in many ways, moving online and creating accessibility, or, not fully or whatever, but that the ability to access information, events, experiences online from your home. I hope we don't lose the fact that we did that and we can do that. And let's make sure that we continue offering accessible experiences like that as we start. Well, we're America's starting to open up, but the rest of the world isn't. So
yeah, that's
a whole nother freak out. All right, I am having a little freak out about a series on Karina Longworth's podcast, You Must Remember This, which I think me and Carolyn have both talked about at different moments. And there is a series she did on Polly Platt called The Invisible Woman. And I'm I'm nowhere done with it, but I just kind of wanted to shout it out because I think it is something that would be very of interest to people who listen to this podcast. The story of Polly Platt, how she is production designer, screenwriter, producer, just amazing, visionary when it comes to film, and how she just was completely erased from so much of her early work. She married Peter Bogdanovich, who and had a bunch of babies, and he she worked to build up his career, and so it's really she co-directed a lot of the films that he did while they were together. So much of her vision is in them. So much of her I'm going to just figure out how to be a production designer because that's what the film needs, or trading her producing credits for better distribution deals. She just got fully fucking erased from so much of her work. And, it's tragic and I think important to recognize and remember and know this history for those of us who love this space and love media and the people who created who really actually created it. And it's interesting because as a part of the podcast, the Karina, the author or the creator of it, was talking about how this wasn't abnormal, right? That a lot of wives of directors who were also into filmmaking dedicated their careers to helping their husbands succeed at the cost of any credit for them, even though they were so intertwined in it. And oh God, it just makes me so mad. It's so infuriating, one other thing I did want to just mention that it was a brief mention in one of the episodes I listened to, but about how I think it was in the 60s, the idea of the director auteur is really like, there's one person who's credited with coming up with this idea, right? That like before there was a director and everything, but like, everyone worked together to make the film. It wasn't considered the authorship of the director necessarily. And there was a movement that happened in the 60s and 70s that really drove home that idea of like the director as the author. Do you have more detail?
Pauline Kael wrote maybe the defining piece on, at least at that time. Pauline Kael, who was, speaking of women who left their mark on film and how we make and think and write about and talk about film, one of the most influential film critics of all time, wrote a piece, I believe, in the New Yorker about like basically arguing in favor of what we call auteur theory, and then there was a debate, a kind of heated debate in the critical press between her and another critic. I want to say it was Andrew Sarris, but my history is a little fuzzy on that at the moment. But where they kind of had this debate of ideas in the who wrote for the Village Voice. So it was like these kind of dueling perspectives on film at the time, but yeah, and I mean auteur theory, like I think auteur theory is useful at times, as a way of acknowledging that there are those directors who have way more of a personal style and flair than while then there are other directors who are kind of like by the numbers directors for hire who don't have that. But anyway, there's so much tied up in auteur theory, and we can talk about how auteur theory erases like the collaborative nature of art and makes it seem like, Martin, like even though a filmmaker like Martin Scorsese would be the first to say, Thelma, Shoemaker, who I edit with, like, is essential in defining the look of the film and like the cinematographer and the production, whatever. There's so many people, film lovers, particularly maybe film bros, who like to say like, just that's a fucking Scorsese film. Like it's whatever. Like it's all Scorsese or it's all, whoever. It's all Tarantino or it's all this person or it's all that person, while erasing the contributions that everyone else, has made to it being the film that it is.
Yeah, and I guess I bring it up too because as I was listening to that, so it's mentioned in the podcast just because it was an influential theory that influenced Peter Bogdanovich and Polly Platt as they were becoming directors, as they were coming into film. So it was a bit of an aside, but to me, I just had this moment of like, oh, right, this has not been the standing theory for all of filmmaking, right? Like it was a nice reminder for me that like the things that we take for granted as fact or take for granted as like the way things are usually were not there for all of time, right? And this relates to so much around every cultural aspect of our lives, right? Like the like pink is for girls and blue is for boys bullshit. Like that did not exist for all of time. And it's not even recent. Like that's a very recent thing that happened. And so I just wanted to put, I guess I'm just freaking out about it just as a reminder to myself that like these ideas came from somewhere. They weren't always around. Right. And it's also interesting when you go back and look at older films or older writing about films to be like, yeah, this concept wasn't even how these people were thinking about film in the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, like it just wasn't a part of the dialogue that was happening at that time. So yeah, I said this before, we've mentioned the You Must Remember This podcast. There's like, she does really great in-depth storytelling around some of the history of Hollywood. So if that's your thing, check it out. Highly recommend looking into Polly Platt. She was involved in The Witches of Eastwick, which is a movie that we talked about on this podcast. If you want to go check that out. Carolyn and I think we've talked about broadcast. No, we watched it. I don't think we talked about broadcast news.
Yeah, broadcast news is maybe, if you ask me on any given day what my favorite film is, there's, a 7 out of 10 chance, maybe, depending on my mood that day, that I would say broadcast news is my favorite film. She was involved with that film. I mean, so very important, contributor to Hollywood in much of like the 70s and 80s. And yeah. And also I am just going to say one more thing is that like, there's all of these people who we're quote unquote like uncovering their names and trying to make them more visible in their contributions. And like
maybe something to think about in terms of like, why don't we do that with people now, right? Like, why don't we, attempt to understand who is like should be credited with the work that we appreciate, and like making sure that they're known and acknowledged for that work. And we can contribute to not erasing creators today, So, and before we wrap up, I just want to say that we have a very special guest freak out this week. We love when y'all send us freakouts. And I think this will be of interest to anyone who enjoys discussions around female-focused horror. So take a listen.
Hi, Anita, Carolyn, and Ebony. Thank you so much for everything you do. My name is Katie, longtime listener, first-time caller, and I just wanted to freak out today based on Anita's freak out from a few weeks ago, where she was talking about Sidney Lumet's book, Making Movies. I started reading it and decided to start watching his movies. And so I just finished watching Dog Day Afternoon, and I was absolutely blown away by it. I think this will be a movie that I will keep thinking about for a while. It's such a unique piece. And I was just wondering if you guys had any thoughts on it. But anyway, thanks again. And that's my freak out. Bye.
Thank you so much for that, Caitlin. Y'all should go check out the Plug It Up podcast if you are interested in this topic. Because, plug it up. I actually, Caitlin had reached out to me being like, hey, we're doing this thing. And I was like, oh, this is great timing. We're about to do the Carrie episode. And she's like, yeah, it's this Plug It Up podcast. And I was like, cool. And I did not connect the name of the podcast until I was watching Carrie and was like, oh, that's where it came from. Oh, smart. All right, y'all. If you want to submit your own freakouts, you can do that at feministfrequency.com/freakout. That's FREQOUT. Thanks so much for listening to Feminist Frequency Radio. Join us next week for an episode on something that we don't know yet, but we will by the time you hear it. Also, I just want to let you all know that this Friday, May 21st, is Feminist Frequency's 21st. Nope. It's Feminist Frequency's 12th birthday. It is our 12th birthday. And we are doing a marathon 26-hour live stream to celebrate our birthday and to raise money for Feminist Frequency and the Games and Online Harassment Hotline. It is starting at 1 p.m. May 21st, and we're going to have 26 hours of streaming with 12 different streamers. Please tune in. You can learn about that on our Twitter, but you can follow us and watch the show and participate at twitch.tv/femfreak. Our show is engineered by Rob Para. Carrie Stimson provides technical support. Artwork by Jamie Varon, and our intro music is by Phil Circus. Thanks, y'all.
Bye everyone.